Greetings. Welcome to Grateful Dead Book Reviews. Stuart Ake. I am honored to be joined by Brian Anderson, the author of the much lauded, critically appraised, and loved by heads loud and clear, The Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound and the Quest for Audio Perfection. Brian, thanks for coming, man.
Thank you so much for having me, Stuart. Yeah, this is an honor. It's a real treat.
I know that it's like loud and clear. It's the wall of sound, but the story is much more than the wall itself. Than kind of
Yeah.
like the little thing that they did at Maples Pavilion down in Stanford in '73, and then through the tenure in '74. It's kind of the pursuit of the band's quest for audio clarity from the earliest days. Uh,
hmm
so just can you kind of walk us through how this story came to be? Like how like, I've got to write a book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in 2015, when I was an editor at Vice, I was running the features desk at the tech vertical,
Mhm.
and I got it in my head that I wanted to write, a web feature about the Wall of Sound because it's a story about a groundbreaking piece of technology, but also it would be a way for me at the time, 2014, 2015, to kind of Trojan horse my love for the Grateful Dead and being a Deadhead sort of into like the culture and the Vice readership at the time. And I think we're in a much different world now where like so many people have come around to the Dead, but even back then in 2014, 2015, like a lot of people would, they'd be like, well, you're like really into like metal and doom and punk and hardcore, but you're also into the Grateful Dead, huh? How does that work? Like it was just so people couldn't really compute that. But I was like, if I can write this feature story about the Wall of Sound, which is about technology, but also kind of like, slip this into the culture, gee, that would be like really fulfilling. So I spent maybe a year and a half on that story. And just by sheer coincidence, it published the weekend of the Chicago dates of the Fare Thee Well. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the band. The then surviving Big Four members of the Grateful Dead performed at those shows. So couldn't have planned it, but my feature on the Wall of Sound came out that weekend. It got a bunch of attention. That always feels great. As a journalist or a storyteller, you want people to like spend time with your stories. So it was so funny. I remember that story came out, and there was a couple days of like kind of honeymoon when I was like, wow, I really nailed this. Surely this is the definitive take on the Wall of Sound. I went so deep here. This is great. But then it sort of quickly occurred to me that that story just barely got to scratching the surface of a much deeper story. And mind you, that first web story was like 9,000 words or so, which is that's a lengthy story. But I realized that there's just so much more here. And that's kind of when I first flashed on the idea that like maybe I could write a book about this one day. So I kind of filed that idea away um, you know, over the, next 10 years or so, right? Because that story came out in 2015. The book came out in 2025. So that's like a decade right there. So kind of here and there over that decade, I was, gathering little bits of string, right? Like as I would just consume anything about the Grateful Dead. You sort of realize if you're going to write a book, a nonfiction book like this, you kind of have to read every other book that is out there on the topic just to do that survey. So as I was doing that survey, just like, pulling little bits here and there, keeping in touch with sources who I'd already spoke to, right? Like source maintenance is a big part of doing journalism. So, um, kept pulling little bits together here and there to the point that I had amassed 150 pages just of a raw timeline. Um, that I was able to basically hit the ground running with when I eventually got this book deal. And I got the book deal in late 2022. But what really kind of served as like the precipitating event that like really catapulted this book project into like something that was just like, gee, I kind of maybe want to do this one day to, oh shit, I think this is actually real. Like I can do this was acquiring a piece of the Wall of Sound, which is behind me here. So That was in a 2021 Sotheby's auction. Sotheby's partnered with Grateful Dead Productions to auction off a bunch of decommissioned stuff from the Grateful Dead's warehouse. And I talk about this in the book, but this piece here had the lowest starting bid because that's all I could afford. And I ended up acquiring it. And that's sort of like once I had a piece of this thing like drop into my life, like drop into my lap, that's when I knew like, okay, I have a book here. I can use this piece as a window to tell this much bigger story.
Well,
And
it's how the story begins
how it
too, right?
begins.
The
Yes.
arrival of this inanimate object,
Yep.
but you personify it in some way. So
Yeah.
sorry for interrupting, but it's a
No,
great
it's fine.
intro. Yeah.
Yeah, and when that was happening, so I had it shipped to my childhood home where my parents still live in the Chicago suburbs. I had it shipped there because it was cheaper to ship it there than it would have been to send it to my apartment here in Chicago. So, having my folks there when this thing arrived, like they're bit characters in the book too. Anyone who reads the book will meet my parents. And so having them there when this thing arrived, it was like this total full circle moment. And I knew when the courier rolled up in this truck and like rolled out this piece on a dolly, I was like, this is the opening scene of the book. I knew at the moment it was happening. I was like, this is the opening scene. The book will begin and end in more or less present day, right? And then like, the sort of other 90%, the other 8 chapters or so will sort of march through chronologically from like the very beginning of the band through the end of 1974 when the Wall of Sound was disassembled, broken down, parted out, and then, I sort of track down maybe like what happened to some of this stuff. So that's kind of how I got going on writing this book. But I said there's kind of three answers. The real answer
No.
is that uh, in a very like deadly way, I feel like I've kind of been working on this book my entire life. Like as the child of first generation Deadheads, really, who both kind of orbited the band and each other beginning in the late 60s and saw the Wall of Sound in its iterations in the early to mid 70s, and who would bring my sister and I as toddlers up to Alpine Valley in Wisconsin to see the
Of
Dead in the
course.
late 80s. Like this has just kind of always been there my whole life. I've been captivated in this giant mountain of speakers, right? So finally putting this book out and holding it in my hands, I'm like, this feels like this was my entire life building up to this.
Wow. So, and you kind of get your Grail quest with with the piece of with the artifact, and
Yes.
also just with your family's history. Now, you said
Yes.
that you did a lot of like a lit review, basically, kind of
Yeah.
uh, reading all of that. So
Yeah.
then, what surprised you along the way, or what was not revealed in those things that in your research and journey that kind
Yeah.
of did the veil to Oz, if you will?
Yeah. I think like one thing that revealed itself as I was doing the survey of all of the books, all of the scholarship, all the literature out there is, and that sort of might not be like so apparent to just sort of like the surface level like kind of awareness of the Grateful Dead would be that the Wall of Sound didn't just drop out of the clear blue sky, fully formed one day in 1974. Like this is something that I really try to drive home with the book, and that's why the book literally after beginning in the present day with the artifact arriving, right? Um, Immediately after that, once I sort of set the stage and sort of raise the stakes in that first chapter, then we go back to late 1964, 1965, because that's kind of when this story starts. Like the Wall of Sound was really this years long project that covered the better part of a decade, like sort of the first grand era of this band from 65 to the end of 74. Um, the Wall of Sound was like it was the culmination of all the work that was happening in fits and starts through that decade. A lot of people will point to March 23rd, 1974, the famous sound test at the Cow Palace, which is
Cow
an
Palace.
amazing show, a monumental date, to be sure, in the story of the Wall of Sound. But, a lot of people will point to that. And, in this day and age of like, you know, really shitty, like Google, like the top search return, that's like an AI overview, right? Of anything you search. Like, you'll quite often see like March 23rd, 1974 was like the debut of the Wall of Sound, right? And kind of, but the more that I dug into it, you realize that there's just so much more nuance there. And
Sure.
if you want to point to like what was the first Wall of Sound show, you got to go back to 19, I would argue in 1973 were some of like the first technical like Wall of Sound
Well,
shows.
people would
Yeah.
often reference the Maple show down at Stanford as a different technology
Totally. Yeah.
behemoth, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. And that would be that was the first show of 1973, right? And then they went out and road tested that thing through the frozen Midwest that, the
Let's
winters.
go to Wisconsin.
Let's go to Wisconsin, let's go to, U of I down in Champaign-Urbana. Like I just love that they were like, let's road test this thing out in the frozen Midwest and the plains. It could, because if we can make it work there, like we can make this work anywhere. But yeah, like as I was interviewing folks who literally were in the room with the band in this era, conceptualizing and designing and building the Wall of Sound, all of these people would reference like, they'd say, "Oh, I remember like an early Wall of Sound show in 1971 or 1972." Like they sort of they refer to Wall of Sound uh much earlier than you would think. So I think that's one thing that like I just, I every chance I could get in the book, like I really tried to drive that home that, this thing, it didn't just appear one day fully formed. It was like the logical culmination of all this work that the band and its circle of sound wizards and audio gurus and consultant types, all of the work that they were doing over like a span of years in totally uncharted water. Like that was the other thing that, became very clear was that the Dead and all of their folks who were working on the Dead's audio project, they realized that, by like the late 60s, that they were going to have to just start basically building their own stuff because the top of the line that was out there just wasn't going to cut it for them. So yeah, I think that was something that wasn't it wasn't necessarily like a huge surprise to me because I've been kind of picking up like this idea as I was kind of starting to do this survey, this idea, right, that the Wall of Sound can't just be confined to like 1974. Even though it kind of can, because that year was like um, the Wall of Sound proper at its like greatest expression, right? That year was, I feel like, kind of like a victory lap in some ways of all this work that they'd been doing. Um, but yeah, you got to go back earlier. It's not so easy or like it's black and white to be like, you know, uh, 74 Wall of Sound, anything before that, not Wall of Sound. Like it's
Yeah.
just like everything else with the Grateful Dead, it was just like this progression that happened over time. So I think that's one, big sort of takeaway or something that I tried to illuminate that might not easily or like historically maybe hasn't been really dug into in just like the overall dead narrative.
Well, I think the dead narrative for a long time was kind of limited, right? And
Yeah.
there was actually very little literature out there for a long time. And it was kind of after Jerry's passing in
Yeah.
95 where there was a reevaluation. And so we
Yeah.
were kind of living in the mythological era, stuff like kind of bordering on myth at least. Hey,
Yeah.
so, Brian, like you did interviews, 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 interviews.
Yeah.
So I'm always fascinated in the writing process of editing. Like what ends
Yeah.
up to go into the film, like what ends up on the cutting room floor and what serves the story. So how do you map that out as a writer?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I knew that I would have to cover certain aspects of established Grateful Dead history and lore. Like I knew that there was no way around certain parts of you know, the story that has kind of already been told, right? Stuff in McNally's Long Strange Trip, right? Like there's certain stuff that I knew I couldn't get around and I had to cover, right? Um, but you realize when you write a book about the Grateful Dead that the temptation is so real to want to write about every show the Grateful Dead ever played and like dig in as far as you can to each of those events. And you simply cannot because that book, you probably won't ever finish writing that book. Because it's just like it's bottomless, right? So I had to put like some really like pretty firm guardrails um, on like the editing process, really. Like when I was working on the first draft, it was really throw everything at the wall. Like I would always rather have more than less to work with. But to
Okay.
give you an idea, like the final draft, like the final version of the book that you can hold in your hands, I believe the word count is 115,000 words is like the final word count. But the first full draft that I finished was like 300,000 words.
Oh, good
So
grief.
I had to like really, really, really cut it down. Um, but sort of, the way I do that is by like starting from the top and it's like brushing out a knot in someone's hair. Like you start at the top and you just read through it and anything that is not like pushing the story forward, it has to go. And that just might be like a word or two here and there. But if you do that enough times, starting from the top and just like brushing it out, suddenly after doing that, I don't know, 15 or 20 times, you've shaved off 100,000 words. So like it was just a matter of just like compressing it just to like the pure essence of what I needed. Um, and each time you go through doing that, it becomes clear like what absolutely must stay and what needs to go. And there's a saying in journalism, kill your darlings, right? Like darlings being those like little turns of phrase or those like bits of very colorful writing that are maybe like really clever. And as a writer, you're like, ooh, like that's a delicious run of words that I just strung together. Aren't I like, ha ha ha, I'm so smart, right? It's that stuff that you realize that all has to go. That's the stuff that like you feel like the best about that that has to be cut actually.
Well, it's a different form of writing, right? I
Totally.
mean, it's a different form of writing for a different time and place versus what you were trying to tackle here.
Right, exactly. Um, but yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, there was so much that hit the cutting room floor. And I saved all of that stuff because I'm like, you never know. Like just so many amazing, like anecdotes that I got from individuals who I spoke to that like ultimately just couldn't make it in. Um, Other stuff that like, I came to, I was getting down to the wire and I'm like, I really love this material, but is it driving the story forward? No, then like it's got to go. But yeah, I've saved all of that stuff. I've got, a file with just all the scraps from the cutting room floor. So yeah, but like given those word counts I gave you, like I had to shave off, almost 200,000 words
Wow. And
from
and was that from you, or is that also coming from the publisher,
yeah,
like
yeah.
that dialogue? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, my editor, Mark Resnick, is amazing. He's, been the hidden hand behind so many of the biggest Grateful Dead titles. So like to fall in with St. Martin's and to have this book be like in the St. Martin's Grateful Dead canon, I still cannot like I kind of disassociate. Like, Mark, my editor, he put out Big Steve's memoir. He did the Kreutzmann memoir, Peter Richardson's No Simple Highway, like so many other Dead books. So to fall in with him, I was just like, I don't know, I felt like so kind of blessed and grateful. But he was great. Like his approach, he would read through, he would read through drafts and sort of identify like he'd be like, okay, so, on pages like 47 to 53, maybe you can tighten that up to like maybe 2 pages, like that kind of
Wow. Okay.
direction. And then once it got into the later stages, there'd be more like nitpicky stuff when I'd be working with like the copy editing team and when it was going through the legal review, especially like some of the more like nitpicky stuff kind of starts to get like tweaked or cut or rethought or whatever. Um, but yeah, Mark's direction was amazing. And from the very beginning of the process, he was like, it's up to like however you want to do this is cool with me. If you want to send me like a draft of each chapter as you go, you can do that. If you want to send me the whole thing in like one big drop, you can do that. Or if you want to send me like a couple chapters at a time, you can do that. So it's that third arrangement is what we ended up doing. I sent him
Okay.
like I remember I wrote through the first 3 chapters, sent those over to him just to basically get his like, hey, this is great. It's going in the right direction. Like just keep going. And then I wrote through chapters 4 through 7. I sent those to him just to get his thoughts to be sure I'm not like going way off the path that I need to be on. And he was like, "This is great. Just keep going. Like get to the end." And then I sent him 8 through 10 the chapters, sent those to him, and he was like, "This is great." And then we sort of looked at the whole thing, and we were like, "Okay, now we need to shave off 200,000 words. Like kind of
Thank
go
you.
do that. Here's some direction on how to do that. But yeah, Mark, shout out Mark Resnick. He was so amazing to work with, and he was just like such a champion. And he believed in this book from day one, and I feel so grateful that I fell in with him.
So I want to kind of stay in there and also bring back the thing where you were talking about like your clever turns of phrase. So then just author voice, your writing
Yeah.
voice, if you will. Like through the editing process, did that become more refined? Or did you kind of know, going back to what you were saying, hey, I'm going to kind of refrain from being cute or whatever, like I'm going to have those really fanciful
Yeah.
phrases in there.
Yeah.
How about that as a writer?
Yeah. Yeah. I usually sort of when I'm working through kind of the first draft of anything, yes, every once in a while I will recognize in the moment like, oh, this is a bit too rich here. I'm gonna delete this. But in the interest of just like throwing everything at the wall and just kind of getting to the finish line of the first draft and not because it can get very much uh it can become the kind of thing where you start to lose sight of the forest for the trees. If you start
Okay.
to agonize over like little like word choices in that first draft. It's like the point you got to just like get to the end of the first draft and then you can start like really refining stuff. Um, so uh so I think it's like it's kind of a mix. Like as I'm going along, like I said, every once in a while I recognize in the moment like this is way too cute here. I should cut this or just like um rejigger, like maybe take some of the cuteness out. Um,
Yep.
but other times those kind of moments maybe reveal themselves when you're starting from the top again. And so,
Hmm.
like edit through with a fresh set of eyes, then you realize like, oh, like 5 months ago when I was working on this earlier chapter, like I thought maybe this turn of phrase would work, but now that I'm done with the draft and going back through it, oh, I need to totally rethink what I said here based on like how I ended up like just following the arcs of the story to the end of the draft. So I don't know if this is answering your question, but like
No,
it's you
no,
know it's uh you kind of do that a bit yourself. But also, like as an editor myself, that was sort of an interesting thing working on this book is, I'm a writer and a journalist, but like historically, when I've been working at media companies, I've been an editor. So I was kind of wearing both of those caps simultaneously as I was working on this. Um, so I could kind of self-edit to a degree, but I'm also a big believer in this idea that, like, as a writer, you're only as good as your editor.
Are you going to, with your with next projects, are you going to kind of stick with what you were doing with Vice before, with like kind of longer form narratives, or
Yeah.
is there a book on the horizon outside
Yeah.
the Grateful Dead sphere, inside? What do you
Yeah.
do?
Yeah, long form nonfiction narrative journalism is just my bread and butter. That's just like what I love to do. I put out a big story at the beginning of this year in the music issue of Alta Journal. They hit me up to write the Grateful Dead chapter of their music issue. And it's it's like a 4,000 word story that I wrote for them. And that focused on the Mirror Beach acid test, which occurred in December 1965. And I sort of see that single event as like a flashpoint in psychedelic music as we know it. That was the first time that the Grateful Dead, who had just changed their name from the Warlocks, the Dead, Owsley Stanley, aka Bear, and the Pranksters. That was the first time those three pillars were all in the same room together, and kind of nothing was ever the same after that. So that was fun to sort of write through that. Um, I'm working on another piece for Alta that's about the Dead that'll probably be coming out early summer-ish.
Hey, Brian Anderson, loud and clear. My favorite read of 2025,
Oh,
and
thanks.
really, really well done, and
Thank you.
gets my highest recommendation. Thanks for carving out some time.
Of course, my pleasure. This was so great to come and chat with you, and thanks for the kind words about the book. That really means a lot.
You got it. Thanks, Brad.
All right.